Thank you, Dr. Gish, Dr. Awbrey. We're now going to go into our question and answer time for the remainder of this evening. I know the hour is late, but you do get to set your clocks back an hour tonight. So in essence, you've gained the next hour, if we can explain that. I'm going to direct the question alternately to each of the men. For instance, I'll direct the first question to Dr. Gish. He has 2 minutes to respond. Then Dr. Awbrey gets to respond for 2 minutes. Dr. Gish, 1 minute of a rebuttal. And then Dr. Awbrey, another minute. Then we go to the next question. Dr. Gish. Dr. Awbrey claims that creationists deny relativity, quantum mechanics, and stellar evolution. Can you clarify once again the creationist position on that stand?
Creationists do not necessarily deny that quantum mechanics or the theory of relativity. Now, there's some creation scientists who question whether Einstein's theory of relativity is really correct. As a matter of fact, there's some evolutionists do that. Herbert Dingle was a famous British astronomer who's questioned whether Einstein was right with his theory of relativity. But the question of whether relativity is right, or whether quantum mechanics is correct, is irrelevant to this question here about creation and evolution. We don't want to throw out that sort of thing. Not at all. What we're trying to do is discuss the relative merits of theory of evolution and the theory of creation. And these other areas are simply irrelevant. Now, about stellar evolution, so-called, yes, you bet. I deny stellar evolution. You have a cloud of gas, supposedly a cloud of gas, hydrogen gas, 1 trillion miles across, somehow collapses on itself by gravitational attraction. Listen, when that starts to happen, that cloud of gas starts to get hot. And you have then gas pressure pushing out. And calculations show unquestionably the gas pressure pushing out exceeds the gravitational force pulling in by 50 to 100 times. That cloud of gas is never going to collapse to form a star. It's physically impossible for that to happen. And some has more or less admitted that that is true. You've got to have some outside help to make that happen. You've got to have another star explode. But then you've got to have a star to make a star. And that doesn't explain where stars came from in the first place.
Dr. Awbrey?
Well, stellar evolution, of course, impossible, you hear. All I can tell you is that I told you about, the data that you can go read for yourselves. And all the calculations in the world do not match up to a simple fact. There are brand new stars out there, 560 light years from the Earth. And the reason that creationists really find themselves opposed to things like quantum mechanics and to evolution, to relativity, as you can see if you read the new physics textbook by Dr. Barnes, that is that every branch of science keeps running into the idea that the universe is extremely large, the universe is extremely old, and these are anathema to this particular version of creation science. It does matter very much to creation science how old the universe is. They would like for the speed of light to change, for example. And it's been postulated by several creation scientists that the speed of light does change, that now it's much slower than it used to be. And of course, that means then that other things based on the same thing would also be changing. Radioactive decay would have been much, much faster before, so that 10,000 years ago, make it look like the universe is 4 billion years old. Factor of 400,000, you would have 400,000 times as many radioactive decays per second going on, the Earth would melt. Little things like that. You run into these inconsistencies. So it's nice to be able to just say, oh, those things don't count. They do count.
Dr. Gish.
Well, evolutionists believe it takes hundreds of thousands of years for a star to form. How then can any human observer see a star form? Obviously, it's impossible. They see a cloud of gas out there which they postulate may form a star. And they postulated that for the Orion Nebula until they discovered the matter that they were looking at, instead of collapsing, was rushing out at enormous speed. It wasn't doing what they thought it was doing at all. No one has ever seen a star form. And the mechanics of it, the physical mechanics of it, shows it's impossible.
I can only tell you, go read the article. That's enough.
Okay. Dr. Awbrey, you say that evolution conforms to natural laws. What about the second law of thermodynamics? How can life go from simple to complex?
Oh, well. The second law of thermodynamics, I'll say it, they'll say it, so we'll go through. The second law of thermodynamics, as it is, and I'm not a thermodynamicist, so I'm not an expert, I really shouldn't even talk about this. But the second law of thermodynamics, really, as creationists stated, applies only to systems that are closed to the input of energy. It does not prevent simple from going to complex. If it did, for example, I saw Dr. Gish had a slide up of another Nobel Prize effort, and this is the one that Miller and Urey won the Nobel Prize for, showing that if you just put energy into a gas, with methane and other things that they proposed at the time might be like the Earth's atmosphere, it would form all kinds of organic chemicals. Now, at the time, nobody knew how organic chemicals could have been formed on Earth. If they were right about the second law of thermodynamics, there could not possibly have resulted these complex gases from just putting, these complex organic molecules, from just putting energy into a gas. Now, the creationists go on and they criticize this for a trap. These experiments have been repeated hundreds of times in different ways with different mixtures of gases, including one that's just like the atmosphere of the Earth today with a little more carbon dioxide in it. The only thing that's important is that there not be a lot of oxygen in it. And there's good paleontological evidence to believe that there wasn't any oxygen. So the second law of thermodynamics, as stated by creationists, is not the second law of thermodynamics that won Prigogine the Nobel Prize, for example.
Thank you. Dr. Gish.
Well, as far as the second law of thermodynamics is concerned, let me point out, Dr. Awbrey's already admitted that it applies to an isolated system or a closed system. No question about it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in his view, according to his belief, the universe is a closed system. It is an isolated system. There's no question that the second law of thermodynamics applies to the origin of the universe. There's no way getting around that. It's not an open system. Nobody out there did any work on it. Nobody brought anything in from the outside. It was an isolated system. Everything that took place within this universe was a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says, in that case, without exception, you cannot go from disorder to order, from simple to complex. You always go in the opposite direction. So there is no way this universe could have created itself naturally. Now, Awbrey says, however, if you can bring energy in from the outside, then evolution is possible. Well, let's take a look at that idea. You see a car sitting on a hillside and spontaneously just runs uphill all by itself. No, that never happened, does it? But Dr. Awbrey says you can get the car to go uphill without violating the second law of thermodynamics, and I agree. But he says all you need is energy. All right, let's try that. We get a can of gasoline, we pour it over the car and light a match. Well, the car doesn't go uphill, it goes up in smoke. Now, if you want that car to go uphill, what do you have to do? You have to put the gasoline into a what? You've got to put it into a motor. Only if you have a motor there that can take that raw, uncontrolled energy and any motor. You don't need any control. Just bring in that energy, and that's all. Ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't do it. That just breaks everything down. That destroys everything. That doesn't create anything orderly, complex, or structured whatsoever.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Would you like to respond?
Well, in the first place, disorder to order, I always hear it, disorder to order, simple to complex. Well, the simpler you make things, the more ordered they are. So disorder and complexity go together. So you don't go from disorder to order and simple to complex at the same time. Those are opposites from one another, and I always hear that. It distresses me a little bit because it's contradictory. The idea of an energy plan and a pre-programmed motor to make things go. The sun shines on the earth. As a result of that, the atmosphere heats up, water evaporates from the ocean, you get weather fronts moving across the face of the earth. These weather fronts are extremely complex. They're just as a result of the sun heating up the earth. But look at the order in that. There's no pre-coded plan there, and there's no energy motor for it. And it's the same thing that leads to the Urey-Miller type result too. There's no energy motor, there's no pre-coded plan there. They're just simple chemistry and simple thermodynamics.
Dr. Gish.
Well, Dr. Awbrey is saying if you just have sunshine, that generates tornadoes, which are ordered structures. Well, if Dr. Awbrey doesn't know the difference between a tornado and evolution, then I can't help him a bit. There's nothing I can say that would be of any help. Now, as far as the Miller-Urey experiments are concerned, I suggest you obtain a copy of my book on the book table on the origin of life. And I show why it has no relevance to the origin of life whatsoever. Because they had to employ a trap to get the very trivial results that they got. They had to have a trap. There's no trap on the primitive earth. And even if you have a trap, that's fatal also. If you trap out the product to remove it from the energy source to prevent its destruction, then you're end of the road. You cannot go any farther because you have removed the product from the energy source. You cannot go to the next step because you need energy to go to the next step, and so it has no relevance to the origin of life whatsoever. Those things are just exercises in organic chemistry which have no relevance to the origin of life whatsoever.
Dr. Gish, do you think it would be intellectually honest and intellectually more stimulating to students to have both evolution and creation models taught fairly, honestly, and respectfully, and allow students to make up their own minds based on the inherent strengths or weaknesses of each model? Would you be willing, would you advocate that evolution be allowed to stand on its own against a competitive model?
Absolutely. Absolutely. At the time of the Scopes trial, there was a law in the state of Tennessee that you could only teach evolution. You could only teach creation. We're not allowed to teach evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, that law should never have been on the books. It was a violation of the academic and religious freedoms of those people who believed in evolution. Well, that law has been removed, unconstitutional. But it's strange today, 60 years later, we're 180 degrees around in the other direction. Now, what these evolutionists are saying is we can only teach evolution. That's all we can teach. We cannot teach the scientific evidence for creation. Well, I wish we had Clarence Darrow here to plead our case today, because at the time of the Scopes trial, he thundered its bigotry to teach only one theory of origin. You must teach both. Well, the evolutionists were arguing that way then, but they're not arguing that way now. Now they want to teach only evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, when any theory freezes into dogma, that is bad science. It's no longer open to challenge, you see. That's bad science. It's bad education. And there's no question that it deprives our young people of the privilege of having a real, meaningful education in science. And it violates our academic and religious freedoms. No question about it.
Dr. Awbrey.
Well, the scientific community is not really opposed to teaching any particular theory. We're opposed to having to teach one because it's legislated in. The theories that we teach are theories that have earned their way into the scientific textbooks. Creationism earned its way out of the scientific textbooks in the last century. There were all kinds of creationist scientists. They tried to save creationism step by step, point by point. They realized that they couldn't. That one thing after another about their creationist beliefs were wrong, and it just didn't fit science, so they abandoned it. So we're not opposed to teaching it if it is a valid theory. And all you've got to do to make it a valid theory is to bring in the data that show that you're right. And they have to be good, powerful data, and they're not superficial arguments about gaps that have been well answered. How on earth do you answer them in a one-hour debate? Come take a course where we teach those kinds of things. It takes a whole college career to do it. Go to the library. There's massive stuff there. So we're not opposed to teaching creationism. What will happen if you teach creationism in the schools is something that I don't want to see happen, and I don't think you do either. That is, people are going to look at the basis of that theory. You can't just have a theory that says, or teach the students facts or the data about abrupt appearance of the universe and life in complex form without any definition of any of that, because people are going to look back and they're going to find the basis of it, and they're going to take the basis of it apart scientifically. And I don't think you'll be happy with that.
Dr. Gish.
I'm not one bit hesitant to allow the case for creation to stand on the scientific evidence. I'm eager to fight the battle on that basis, but apparently the evolutionists are not. Dr. Awbrey was one of the two professors at San Diego State that arranged a symposium at the AAAS meeting, American Association for Advancement of Science meeting, in Santa Barbara a couple of 3 years ago. He wanted to have creationists confronting evolutionists. Guess what? There were 10 evolutionists on the program and 2 creationists. Now, that is their idea of a fair confrontation between creation and evolutionists. Well, there must be something wrong when the evolutionists have to have 10 of them and only 2 of us to fight an even battle in this confrontation. And I say we ought to have not that. That was nothing more than just indoctrination, as we have in the colleges every day. It was not what we ought to have, and that is a fair hearing for each side.
Dr. Awbrey.
Every time I hear this, I'm amazed. We were the very first scientists, the only ones that gave creationists a chance to present their data at a scientific meeting where it could be judged by scientific peers. They came and they gave the same stuff they always do, and then they complained that somehow or other science is supposed to be determined as a popularity contest. Your views, or the validity of your views, when you want to change, you have an extraordinary theory, and you want to change the way the entire world looks at science, you better have extraordinary data to back them up. They don't have those data. They didn't present it. We've never gotten them to define exactly what their model is. Until you put out all the postulates of your theory and let people show that they're true or false, you don't stand a chance. Put out the postulates of your theory and defend them with facts, not with quotations of Michael Denton.
Dr. Awbrey, what is your single greatest argument which shows that evolution did occur?
There isn't any single greatest argument that shows that evolution occurred. The theory of evolution is a theory with a number of postulates. Then there's a theory of natural selection. It's a number of postulates. And the thing that convinces me that evolution occurred is that every one of these postulates has been tested, has been sniped at, has been modified, but has not been shown to be false. And there's a tremendous number of lines of evidence coming from all kinds of directions that all point the same way. If there was only one kind of evidence that pointed to evolution, I would question it much more. But when we have 6 or 7 lines of evidence all coming the same way, then I think it is very, very compelling. And, things that are not filled by the fossil record are filled in by biochemistry, embryology, comparative anatomy, and so on. So it all fits together. And when things fit together, we're compelled to accept it for the moment. Somebody comes up with good evidence, I'm willing to reject it.
Dr. Gish?
Well, Dr. Awbrey says we have every postulate put forth by evolutionists proven to be true. That's absolute nonsense. The theory of embryological recapitulation, the notion that the human embryo recapitulates its evolutionary ancestry, has been proven false. Even evolutionists, knowledgeable evolutionists, do not believe that anymore. Scratch that. What about vestigial organs? Practically every so-called vestigial organ now known to have a true function. Scrap that. What about the biochemical data? What does Dr. Denton say? He is a molecular biologist. The molecular biology does not support evolution. And it's getting worse every day as far as evolution is concerned. What happened when we got to Mars? Did we find what the evolutionists predict? I should say not. Did we find life on Mars? Absolutely not. Did we find even a trace of any organic material on Mars? Not even a trace. Yet they predicted, they expected that we'd find that there. What about the fossil record? They've been looking intensely for those transitional forms. Did we find what Darwin predicted? Did we find what evolutionists had predicted for 125 years? I should say not. We found precisely the opposite. How can Dr. Awbrey sit there and say that every postulate of evolution has been proven to be true? As a matter of fact, just the opposite is true. And ladies and gentlemen, it's getting worse and worse. What we are seeing today, the theory of evolution, is in the process of self-destruction. We creationists really don't have to do a thing. We'll just sit back and wait.
Dr. Awbrey.
I told you, didn't I, that he would bring up recapitulation, batter some science that had been outdated for 50 years. Vestigial organs, I showed you a vestigial organ. There are other vestigial organs. Did you know that whale fetuses have, these are baleen whales, they don't have teeth as adults, have a complete set of teeth as a fetus, and they're resorbed before they are born. Whale fetuses also develop leg buds that are then reabsorbed. Some whales have legs, hind legs, underneath the skin. Vestigial organs. Function? Come on, give me a function for fetal whale teeth. When you're in the uterus, what on earth do you need teeth for? Somebody once said, well, maybe it'll keep them bleeding to death. I mean, if they pulled them out, they'd bleed to death, and those teeth prevent that from happening. That's a kind of post hoc explanation that I expect. There's no function for those teeth. And don't tell me that the creator who could go blink and blink a universe into existence couldn't create a whale without teeth in its fetus. Those are vestiges of its ancestry.
Dr. Gish.
Dr. Awbrey is using this old argument of vestigial organs. I'm shocked. 100 years ago, a German scientist said the human body had 180 vestigial organs, including the thymus gland, the pituitary gland, the tonsils, the appendix. Now we know the true function of all of those structures. The list of vestigial organs have gone from 180 down to practically zero. And Dr. S.R. Scadding, an evolutionist from Guelph University in Canada, published an article in Evolutionary Theory in May of 1981, in which he said there is no evidence for evolution from this so-called vestigial organs. He says, first of all, we've proved that practically every one of these things has a true function. And the very 2 or 3 that may be left, it's impossible to prove that they have no function. What is the function of fetal teeth? Listen, the jaws will not develop normally unless they are there. They do serve a function some stage during the development of the creature. They do have a function. If they're not there, the animal does not develop correctly. And that is just, well, the evidence for evolution is getting shakier and shakier, as Dr. Denton, a non-creationist, has stated very plainly.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Next question to you. How do you justify creation being science if it has a supernatural creator?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 propositions here. Either a creator or no creator. Which is more religious? The non-theistic version of origins, which is dogma with the American Humanist Association, for example. The American Humanist Association has defined humanism as a non-theistic religion. Get that? A non-theistic religion. In that same literature, they quote Sir Julian Huxley, who says that a humanist is one who believes that man is not a product of a supernatural creator, but he's a product of evolution. That's a basic dogma of humanism, atheism, agnosticism, and so forth. To teach that exclusively in our public schools is teaching religion, ladies and gentlemen. The way to be neutral is to teach both the evidence for creation and the evidence for evolution. No creator or a creator, you see. That's the only fair, honest way to deal with the subject of origin and preserve our democracy in this pluralistic democratic society where the schools are tax supported by all of us.
Dr. Awbrey.
Well, humanist is used as a dirty word, but just because some organization accepts the tenets of a particular science, how does that taint the science, and how does it change what the science is? The whole idea of teaching the evidence for creation. In the Arkansas trial, as I showed you before, there were a number of tenets. And there was supposed to be the evidence for these tenets, these postulates of creationism. Now, in the Louisiana case, all it says is abrupt appearance of life in the universe in complex form. Don't define abrupt, don't define complex, nothing is defined. What are you going to teach? Evidence for what? I haven't any idea. Neither does anybody else, but you could really teach a lot of things there. With that, you could teach evolution.
Dr. Gish?
Dr. Awbrey says just because there's some people like the American Human Association, which are atheists, accept evolution, that doesn't cause it to be thrown out. Neither does it just because Christian Heritage College here, with their Christian presuppositions, accept creation, that shouldn't throw it out either, should it? Now,
That's right.
here's an article published by Dr. Larry Loudon, who was then professor at Pittsburgh University, University of Pittsburgh. He is an evolutionist. He says that decision in Arkansas was all wrong. It was taken for all the wrong reasons. He says if that decision in Arkansas is not challenged by the scientific community, that would bring into doubt the intellectual integrity of the scientific community. Let me tell you, evolutionists do not challenge that decision in Arkansas. They trumpet it. They promote it. Dr. Larry Loudon, this professor of the philosophy of science, says in doing so then it brings into question the intellectual honesty, the intellectual integrity of the scientific community. And I would agree with that, ladies and gentlemen. What Dr. Loudon is saying, let's get it all out in the open, let's discuss it from both points of view, and let's have a fair battle between the two sides.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Dr. Awbrey?
That's happening at the university level now. High schools and junior high schools and elementary schools are probably not the proper place for this sort of a discussion, or this sort of a battle. The problem, of course, is when you allow supernatural into it, then you're allowing other things than theism in that are supposedly supernatural that we can't explain by science. And so we might have to end up teaching astrology as a parallel to astronomy, or ESP as a parallel to psychology. And so you really have to keep things that are outside of science, that fall outside of science, like a deity or super intelligent, super technological species somewhere else in the universe, anything like this. You got to keep them out of science. We have to talk only with those things that we can show to be wrong. And we can't show the supernatural to be wrong. That's the only reason.
Dr. Awbrey, skipping the vague intermediates between similar animals that are highly disputed by all concerned, please tell us of your theory of the first intermediate between nothing and hydrogen.
I'm not going to respond to that question. It's too preposterous.
Dr. Gish?
Gish certainly will.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when evolutionists ask, where did the cosmic egg come from? They say, we just leave that to the theologians or to the philosophers. Now,
That's where it
anybody who
belongs.
says he's going to explain everything naturally is getting off to a bit of a bad start when he starts out that way, you see. Now, the Big Bang Theory is kind of falling on hard times today. There's a lot of things wrong with it, and they've known it for a long time, and they've been trying to paper over the holes in the Big Bang Theory and finally given up on that. And they're suggesting something else, that the universe started with something the size of an electron. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Something the size of an electron, that was it. And then for some strange reason, the thing inflated itself and finally became the universe. Now, you talk about a series of miracles, ladies and gentlemen. What these people, they get up with serious faces as serious scientists and propose a whole series of miracles. And miracle number one, the origin of the primordial atom. Miracle number two, why did it inflate itself? Miracle number three, it had to inflate itself in just a particular way, or it would expand forever, or it would collapse back on itself and never become this universe. Somebody asked Michael Turner, University of Chicago, what's the probability of that happening? He said, let me illustrate it this way. The probability is equal to the probability you could take a dart, throw it clear across the universe, and on the most distant quasar, hit a target 1 millimeter in diameter. You talk about a miracle of miracles. Here is a whole series of miracles, what they propose as serious science, and say that we cannot go into the classroom and suggest the miracle of creation. At least we've got a miracle maker for our miracles. They have a whole series of miracles with no miracle maker. And it certainly sounds like lousy science to me.
Dr. Awbrey, your response?
Now I can talk about why Big Bang cosmology is science, in spite of it being called miraculous. Big Bang cosmology is science for one reason only, and that's because it makes falsifiable predictions. There are all kinds of experiments going on right now testing the falsifiable predictions of Big Bang cosmology. And many of them are falsified. And so they modify the theory and they go on. There's no question in my mind that what was proposed as the original Big Bang was not what really happened. But it won't be just a plain miracle. Instead, it's going to be a modification of that theory. You see the theory being modified now. It still makes postulates. You still don't have to say, oh, gremlins did it, or something like that. So as long as you have a theory that makes predictions, then, all right, you can test those predictions. But when you have a theory where anything can happen, it's not science. That's the difference.
Thank you. Dr. Gish?
Let me explain why, ultimately, the theory of evolution is non-falsifiable. It just doesn't make any difference what the data is. You just change your theory. The theory has become so plastic it doesn't make any difference what the data is. You can make the theory fit somehow or other. And Dr. Awbrey has said the same thing. Maybe you suggest the Big Bang theory is wrong, so you try something else and you keep doing that, and 1 million years from now you're still wondering how the universe came into existence. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not science at all. There's just simply a scenario that no one can ultimately disprove. Now, you can disprove a certain aspect of a theory, but ultimately it's impossible to disprove the notion that the universe has evolved or life has evolved, because if you disprove any part of it, they just come up with a new theory. And so it is not a scientific theory. It is metaphysics. It is religion, pure and simple.
Next question directed towards Dr. Gish. You're going to have to excuse my layman interpretation of some of these words and legibility. Can you comment on the two most frequently used evidence for transitional forms? Archaeopteryx?
Australopithecus?
That's what I was going to say. And the so-called horse sequence. Well,
First of all, I've already commented on Australopithecus. That's Lucy, Dr. Louis Leakey's Ginjanthropus and so forth. We've already discussed that. So I doubt if that would be of much use to discuss that any further. But I would like to talk about the horse. You know, I've been all around the world, debated evolutionists, and lectured in colleges and universities all over the United States and Canada and many countries of the world, and very rarely today do I hear horses mentioned. The evidence for evolution from the horse is practically never mentioned anymore. Why? Because it's just lousy evidence. We have different kinds of horses, ladies and gentlemen, as fossils, but we do not have intermediate forms. Here's an article that appeared in the Houston Chronicle by Boyce Rensberger, who was the chief editor of Science 81, 82, and so forth and so on. And this is what he reported in that article after being at a meeting with paleontologists. He says, the popularly told example of horse evolution, suggesting a gradual sequence of changes from four-toed, fox-sized creatures living nearly 50 million years ago to today's much larger one-toed horse, has long been known to be wrong. Instead of gradual change, fossils of each intermediate species appear fully distinct, persist unchanged, and then become extinct. Transitional forms are unknown. End of quote. Yes, we have different kinds of horses, but we do not have anything to indicate that one changed into the other. Just like today, we have different kinds of primates. We have monkey, we have apes, and we have people. Bury them all suddenly, and you'll have a nice evolutionary sequence for evolutionists. Monkey, apes, and people. But you don't have the transition form, and that's true of the horses as well.
Dr. Awbrey.
The horse evolution, of course, is very well known. It's not in trouble. It's not falling apart. Matter of fact, the more fossils that Tom Patton and people like that dig up of horses, the stronger the evidence get. The thing that people are talking about as being wrong with the horse evolution is this general simplified picture that you see, or that you generally see, of horses going bing, 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 only one going to another. What there are lots of side branches, evolutionary side trips, and so on going out there. And these things are there. But the general transitional form, the change in the brain, the change in the teeth, the change in the legs, the change in the general skeletal structure. These things are very, very well documented. Simpson documented them a long time ago. The evidence still stands. Go read it in a good textbook, or better, go to a library and look up invertebrate paleontology articles about it and read it. Read what Simpson had to say about it. He's not in trouble.
Dr. Gish.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there were transitional forms in the fossil record, why would Dr. Goldschmidt and others invent the hopeful monster mechanism? Why would they suggest, if there are transitional forms between reptile and a bird, why would they say that a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg? Why? Because there are no transitional forms. That's why they invented this hopeful monster mechanism. Why did Gould and Eldridge talk about this so-called punctuated equilibrium? Because of the absence of transitional forms. A British evolutionist, Mark Ridley, in an article published just a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, he says no real evolutionist would even try to use the fossil record to support evolution versus creation. Obviously then, Dr. Awbrey is not a real evolutionist, because Dr. Ridley said no real evolutionist would even try to do that. Why wouldn't he? Why, that should be the best evidence we'd have in the world for evolution, be the fossil record. But it's terrible for evolution. Marvelous positive support for creation.
Dr. Awbrey.
If the fossil record is the only support that we have for the theory of evolution, how is it possible for Darwin to come up with the original postulates of it, not based on the fossil record at all? It does not rest on the fossil record. I'll say it again, very patiently. The fossil record supports it, but the basic postulates came from other lines of evidence. And those lines of evidence are there. The libraries and the universities are full of them. I can only tell you, go read, go query for yourself. Don't accept what I say, don't accept what Dr. Gish says. Go read for yourself. Go look at those original data. That's the only place to get that. It's taken me 30 years to get it. It's not easy, but it's there.
We'll take a couple more questions in the time that we have remaining. Dr. Awbrey, how do you account for the lack of solar dust on the moon? If evolution is true, there would be 10 to 12 feet of dust on the moon. We know there's only 2 to 3 inches.
The 2 to 3 inches of space dust on the moon are exactly what's expected based on known measured rates of space dust, the amounts of space dust actually out there in space. And these have been measured by spacecraft. The 10 to 12 feet of it was an estimate based on gathering materials here on the Earth. In fact, as I read in one creationist article, there should have been, 20 miles or something. So it's gone a lot. But that amount of space dust is exactly what you'd expect. Look at it this way. Look at those mountains on the moon. They're rounded off. They're not sharp and jagged, but there's no atmosphere. How'd they get rounded off? They got rounded off by those little space particles coming down, one hitting in each square millimeter, once every 1,000 years. And they eroded away mountains. 4.5 billion years it took them to do it.
Dr. Gish?
There are 2 sources of dust on the moon. Meteoritic dust, dust within the solar system, which comes down to the surface of the Earth, the surface of the moon, and all planets due to gravitation. The other source is the fact that the moon has no atmosphere. Therefore, radiation from space, X-rays, cosmic rays, ultraviolet light, impinges upon the surface of the moon without hindrance. There's these 2 sources because that causes the surface of the moon to crumble to dust. Now, it's incredible that before we went to the moon, all the evolutionists were quite satisfied that we'd measured accurately the influx of meteoritic dust. About 14.5 million tons per year was considered to be a reasonable estimate of the influx of this dust, which would put about 50 to 100 feet of that stuff here on Earth and a lot of it on the moon. When we got to the moon, we had only a thin layer of dust, and all of a sudden they discovered they were wrong all the time. All the measurements, all the estimates, all the processes they used to estimate this was all wrong. Now, furthermore, from the influx of radiation on the surface of the moon, R.A. Littleton, a very famous British astrophysicist, published a book in 1956 in which he said this process alone should have generated miles of dust on the moon in 4.5 billion years. Who said it? Wasn't a creationist, it was an evolutionist. When we got to the moon, only a thin layer of dust. And it really does cause some people to question whether the moon is really 4.5 billion years old. Because if it were, there ought to be a lot of dust on the moon, and there's just enough to make a nice footprint. And it does make some of us, kind of wonder whether that thing is really that old.
Dr. Awbrey.
Littleton's miles of dust, saying that X-rays coming down and hitting the moon and so on should have given us miles of dust, is like saying that a farmer goes out and he plows the top 6 inches of his field every year. And he does that for 100 years, and he's plowed it 50 feet deep. Stuff acts only on the surface. And think about it now. Cosmic rays, little meteorites hitting there. I mean, you pick up rocks on the moon, they've been shattered by meteors hitting them. But ask yourself how, in 10,000 years, could have eroded away whole mountain ranges with one meteorite strike by a micrometeorite that weighs maybe 1/1,000,000th of a gram. It's about the average in 10,000 years. Once every 1,000 years per square millimeter. No way.
Dr. Gish.
I don't quite understand what Dr. Awbrey's talking about. Maybe I didn't quite understand. He apparently is claiming that mountains have been eroded away on the moon. I guess that's what he said.
Yep.
Well, that's not true at all. Where in the world did he get such information? If you eroded away mountains, there ought to be a ton of dust there somewhere. But there isn't.
Yes, there is.
And he assumes maybe there was mountains there. I don't know where he gets that idea either. But if it had eroded away, the dust would be there somewhere, and it isn't. We have just a thin layer of dust.
One last question, Dr. Gish. How would you answer Mr. Awbrey's assertion that new stars have been found now in the universe?
Ladies and gentlemen, there are some stars that are very white and very hot. Now, they cannot exist very long, at the most a few million years, because they are burning up their fuel so rapidly that they burn up in just a few million years. So evolutionists assume that those stars are very young. Well, indeed, they have to be younger than 10 million years. I agree with that. But to assume that they are 10 million years, that's just an assumption. Now, I saw a television program by Nova. I don't think it was more than 2 years ago. The commentator on the program said, of course, twice he said this, of course, no one has ever seen a star form. Now, that was on the Nova program, and of course, nobody has. Now, evolutionists look out there and they see a cloud of some kind or another, and they say, ha-ha, maybe that's where stars are forming. And then the newspapers pick it up, and the reporter says that astronomers are seeing stars form. No, not at all. The fellow said, wait 100,000 years from now, and maybe there will be a proto-star there. Something in the formation, moving toward the formation of stars. Nobody's ever seen a star form. Nobody sees stars forming. It's simply a scenario or an idea.
Dr. Awbrey.
If you listen to this, you get the idea that all this had to start abruptly or something. This is an ongoing process. It's going on all the time. There are stars being born, there are stars dying. And what you see when you look out in space is stars in every stage of birth, life, and death. This is why you do see, now that people have looked at this well enough, got their theories, now they know the theories predict exactly where they should look. They look there, lo and behold, that's exactly where they found the new light from stars. And on the NOVA program, they hadn't seen it. Remember, both of these articles that talk about new stars, 1986. One of them, the 1st of October, 1986. So don't tell me about what hadn't been seen 2 years ago and say somehow or other it refutes what has just been seen this year.
Dr. Gish?
Well, a final comment on this notion. I have an article here published in Scientific American in August of 1981 about the Orion Nebula, in which these astronomers are saying we were wrong. We thought there were clouds of gas was collapsing on itself, where we thought a star was forming. Now it turns out that the matter is racing away at enormous speeds, opposite to that what you need to form a star. And they said, I guess we'll have to look somewhere else to find a star forming. And so we keep coming up with these stories and these notions and these ideas without any real foundation in science.
Dr. Aubrey?
So they did what good scientists do. They modified their theories. They looked again. They looked somewhere else, and they found it. Science doesn't just automatically, I see a really weird view of how science works here. Science doesn't just come up with the answer immediately. We form hypotheses, we test them, we revise them, we form hypotheses, we revise them, and finally we lurch along and get closer and closer to finally understanding the universe. We're a long way from it yet. And I'm glad, because I'm a scientist. It gives me something to do. If we knew everything, I'd go be a librarian. That's not near as exciting.
The hour is late. Obviously, there are more questions than we have time to even answer tonight, but I want to give both Dr. Aubrey and Dr. Gish just a couple of minutes of closing comment before we're dismissed tonight. Dr. Aubrey?
I'm exhausted. This is fun, though. Well, we've both made our case, laid it before you. I know which way most of you are going on it. I'm only asking you, keep your mind open. Don't listen to what somebody tells you somebody else said. Go read it for yourself. The libraries are full of the material for you to look at. It's there. Read it. Then you can understand the evidence from embryology, and you can know what's wrong with bashing the poor old recapitulation theory. And we always talk about things like that. We talk about recapitulation theory because it's a good example of one that was discarded. But the one that preceded it, the biogenetic law, still there. Same thing with the fossil record. We're getting a better fossil record. Look what we've gotten in the last decade for human fossils, because people have gotten interested to go out and look. And the idea, the very fact that there are human fossils there that are exactly intermediate between Homo sapiens and Gish's monkey, Homo erectus, should give you real pause about whether humans have evolved. The evidence really is very, very strong that humans have evolved, that everything else has evolved. We have answers to all kinds of questions, such as, well, what about all of these tremendous gaps? How did you get from an invertebrate to a vertebrate? That's a whole lecture in itself. There's good evidence on it. And anybody who looks at this, looks at proterostomes, deuterostomes, realizes what's going on there, there's a very good line of evidence connected through larvae that leads to this. So we've got a lot of answers. You won't get them here. You won't get them in this short little format like this. You're only going to get them by going to a university, going to the library, and looking to see what the answers to these questions are, and then asking more questions. And, it's good that scientists disagree. It'd be terrible if we all agreed. So these kinds of things, even though creationists are generally wrong, they're right about some things, a few, and they lead people into new lines of research. That's good. So it's a good cross-feedback. But by and large, scientific creationism's tenets that are testable have been tested. The idea of fixed kinds, the idea of a flood, have been tested and failed. So, and they are very important to creationism. And without it, what do you have left? You have theistic evolution. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 centuries ago, the notion that the sun and other planets revolved around the earth was the dogma of the scientific establishment. And Galileo faced determined opposition from fellow astronomers when he suggested otherwise. Louis Pasteur and others about a century ago overturned the established dogma of centuries when they showed that living things never arise spontaneously from dead matter. Today, even though thousands of scientists are creationists, and the number is growing rapidly, the notion of evolution is a stifling dogma. Evolutionists seek to smother all challenges from within or without the scientific and educational establishments, concealing the fallacies and weaknesses of the theory and adamantly opposing a hearing for the scientific case for creation. Why is this so? Well, certainly not, because the notion of evolution is science and the concept of creation is just religion. I can think of two possibilities. First, it may be that evolutionists consider that our students are too ignorant, too illiterate to be exposed to these competing ideas of evolution, or the ideas of origins, I'm sorry. Now, that's true of our public universities, not true here at Christian Heritage College, where the students are exposed to both creation and evolution. But they consider that to be the case, apparently, in the public schools, that these students are too ignorant. They're just too illiterate to be exposed to these competing ideas of origin. They must be protected from error and carefully indoctrinated in correct ideas by those who consider themselves to be the intellectual elite, the sole possessors of truth. Secondly, having engendered these fragile towers of hypotheses piled on hypotheses, where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion, it may be that evolutionists are aware of the fact that the notion of evolution will fare badly if exposed to an open and determined challenge from creation scientists, and that if this is done, the majority of our students will accept creation as the better of the two concepts of origins. Whatever may be the case, it is urgent that our students be exposed to all of the evidence, all of the arguments on each side of this question, so that these two alternative concepts of origin, creation and evolution, can compete freely in the marketplace of ideas, as it has done here this evening. Thank you very much.
Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Frank Awbrey, Professor of Biology at San Diego State University, for being with us tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Dwayne Gish, Vice President for Institute Creation Research, being with us. Let's give them both a hand one more time, shall we?
Thank you.
You've been a great audience. Thank you for your participation, your attentiveness. I remind you again, at the book table as you leave, there's some of the tapes. You can order them, and you can find out more about the book table that is there. Thank you. Good evening.